No one had ever seen an attractive man who was so vulnerable, who was saying, and it was a cultural importance of Clift, is that you can be a man and you can still cry and you can still be sweet and vulnerable and like a wound. And it was very, very appealing.
I find that it would be very difficult for me to separate, you know, the actor and the man and the brother. I think they're all intertwined. But I think you could say mostly he was an actor. And everything that he did had to do with his craft. Anyway, maybe I should go back to our beginnings when we were kids, and there were three of us. I was the oldest, and then 18 months later came the twins, Ethel and then Montgomery a few hours later.
His mother, Sonny Clift, had been born an orphan. She'd been with foster parents and found out at the age of 18 that she was really the child of aristocrats. Her real father was Colonel Robert Anderson, who commanded Fort Sumter, and her other grandfather had been Abraham Lincoln's secretary. Anyway, she spent all of her life trying to be recognized by her real family, and she never was. But she was determined that Montgomery Clift and his sister and brother be raised to the manner born, be raised as aristocrats.
Our early years were spent in Bermuda and France and St. Moritz and München and Vienna, and also Milano and Napoli. We were tutored everywhere we went in French and German. It was interesting, maybe psychologically, that while we lived in Europe, our mother always dressed us like triplets. We had the same short pants, the same haircuts. Even my sister looked just like my brother and me. Monty gave his first acting performance at the age of 8 in our little Swiss apartment near St. Moritz before an audience that included his mother and our tutor and our nurse. While we were traveling, our father was back in the United States working very hard trying to become successful, whatever that means. But he was completely wiped out by the 1932 stock market crash, and we had to return to the United States. So when we got here, we were real misfits. But we had our French bicycles, which saved us from all the neighborhood children who couldn't really understand what we were about and why the girls seemed to like us. And I still don't know why the girls in Chicago would like us very weird people from Europe who didn't speak English very much. After a while, we went to Florida, and then my father got back on his financial feet, and we moved to Connecticut. My sister and I went on to college, but my brother always hated to be forced to learn. So it was very lucky for him that he got a part in a summer stock play, which was fortunately successful, and then went to Broadway, where it ran for 6 months.
So he became an actor, a child actor, and Sonny Clift was the archetypical stage mother, taking him to auditions, telling him how to speak, coaching him. She always had a limousine take him to and from the theater. She spoiled him and pampered him, but always told him that you are the greatest, you're the finest, you are an aristocrat. He didn't know, by the way, anything about his mother's background until I think he was about 21 years old. He didn't understand why he was being raised this way, why he was being kept so isolated, until he was about 21 or 22, and his father finally told him. And Monty just couldn't believe that his mother had done it for that reason, for her own reasons, really, because she had wanted to find her family and to get an identity for herself.
I first met Monty when he was a pupil of mine around 1940, it must have been, because it was right toward the end of the group theater. I'd already started teaching and directing, although I'd been an actor in the group theater for 10 years at that time. And one of the play agents that the group dealt with was a woman by the name of Janet Cohn. And she had a house in Pound Ridge, New York, and she was very friendly with Monty and persuaded Monty to take a little red barn in Pound Ridge. And so he had this little country place, and I used to visit Janet and visit Monty incidentally. And so when I did a play around 1942, a play called Mexican Mural, I had a lot of people from my class in the cast. Monty was one, Kevin McCarthy was another, Libby Holman, and Mira Rostova.
And we got to be friends almost instantly. We had something in common, whether it was taste or a common taste, you know what I mean? It was a sharing of some kind. We all shared something, and I do think it was, we thought that we knew better than other people how things should be done. We were egotistical enough to believe that most of the things we saw were not well done. Most of the acting that we were asked to respect, we thought not very highly of. We thought that we were better than they were, or that we could perform or act better. We thought our taste was better. And therefore, in some way, I suppose that says we thought we must have assumed that we were more intelligent, more cultivated, more something. I don't know what. He was a remarkable person, and the fact that he was interested in us and liked us so much was flattering, possibly, to us, because he seemed the personification of a young prince with all the best qualities. He wanted to attain some sort of heights of, to be the most fruitful person, he used to say. I want to live the most fruitful life. Well, it's unfortunate that in some way the fruitfulness was a dark fruit, a rotten fruit, finally, in the end.
At that time, I was married to Kevin McCarthy. Well, we all became friends. And then I got to know him much better the following summer when Kevin had just gone into the Army, was drafted, That's 42, and I had a job in a summer stock company in Cape Cod, and Monty'd been on tour for a year, and he came up there. And we did a play called The Pursuit of Happiness, and he played. He was always, there were a lot of jokes, there were a lot of, doing things as a lark. And so he put on blackface, and he played the slave, the black slave that comes into the play. The odd thing about him is that both men and women, both sexes, loved him. There was an extra quality about him that really was exciting and fun and dear. He was wonderfully dear and personal.
I had been not well. I'd had a miscarriage, and I was staying out in the suburbs with my mother, and I was very depressed and felt very alone, and I called Augusta to talk to her. And she said she and Monty were together, and it was a Sunday afternoon, as I remember. And she said, "Can you get on the train and get in?" I said, "Yeah, but I can't walk very well. I'm weak." And she said, "That's all right, don't worry about that. Monty will help you." So I got on the train and came in, and they met me in Grand Central Station. And I remember him very well. When I first saw him, he was very slight and very slim and incredible looking, alive, bright, marvelous face. And somehow they just got me out of Grand Central Station and got me to Augusta's apartment, which was 4-flight walk up. And I said, "I can't, there's no way." And he just picked me up like a rag doll and just not walked, ran 4 flights up. And he was not breathing hard at the top. He was in incredible physical condition. And we talked. He was alive, he was funny. Not funny, that's the wrong word for him. He was zany. He had a kind of mad, wild, crazy way about him, and witty, very witty. And the combination of the two was just sheer wonder, sheer delight, I forgot that I had lost a child. I forgot my husband was flying a plane. I forgot, you just were. You became alive. He made everything alive.
I think everybody, in a way, felt that when you were with Monty, I've never had that experience since in my life. There was something very special, and he really treated everyone, individually, I don't mean in a group, but as though one was of great value to him.
I remember that Monty and Augusta and I went to Cuba. I believe it was before 1947. I've seen those photographs. We ran those pictures again, and it was so beautiful. We went to Havana. We went out to the gambling. This was before Castro. This was at the time of Batista was still in power, and you could go to Cuba easily. And there's a scene in there where we were throwing coins to these little native children that seemed to be, poverty-stricken natives along the Malecon there. And Monty was fascinated by all these faces. That's Monty shooting of the film, and I'm throwing the coins around it. And we took pictures of each other. We were doing a lot of pictorial stuff, and beautiful. We'd never known anything like it. Monty was always there, and he was always with us, and wanted always to be there. And wherever we went, he would come, or wherever he went, he sometimes would invite us.
Every girl, woman, was crazy about Monty, and he seemed to be in love with all of us individually. However, he had girlfriends, but there were 2 or 3 of us that he was really very fond of. We were very, very close. But I don't think it's a coincidence that each one of us was married. And so that the relationship was protected by the fact that I was married, a couple of other people that he loved very much. They also were married, and they weren't going to be divorced, nor would he have wanted it, I don't think. I really think the protection was what made our relationship so nice.
So Fred had to report back to the newspaper that he worked for. You had a year to go back to your job after the war. And so we drove in Monty's car, which was a Buick, and I have no idea of the year of it, which he loved dearly and called it Beulah. And Beulah was a person. And we drove across the desert, the southern route, because it was still very cold in March. And we ended up in New Orleans, because Monty had had an amoeba. He'd had an amoebic dysentery and had been in New Orleans many times at a hospital there. And he wanted to make a quick stop because he always checked in with that doctor whenever he could or needed to or whatever. And it was hot in New Orleans. And we would go into the French Quarter every night and eat. And silly things would happen. Monty sat on a chair and the bottom fell out of the chair and he went down through the chair. And we were hysterical, and they literally practically threw us out. It was a wild and wonderful 5 or 6 days. There was one night I remember very well when Monty said very quietly and very gently, "I'm going in by myself." And Fred was delighted. Fred was pleased. He was glad to go to bed. And I said, "Can't I come?" "No," he said, "I want to go by myself." And then, because he never wanted to hurt you, he did later hurt us terribly, but he never wanted to. He just patted my face and he said, "I need to be alone." He said, "You understand that?" I said, "I understand it." But I remember feeling like a child left behind. His playmate, I wasn't going to be allowed to come play. Looking back on that night, I recognize that that probably was something that I was to see a lot later on and not know what to make out of it.
Monty was one of the most exciting actors of his period. It's hard to imagine today how thrilled people were. Teenagers went wild about him. They screamed when they saw a Montgomery Clift movie. Monty was a true seminal influence in the movies and in acting. What's fascinating about his whole technique is that mysterious quality in his mannerisms, his eyes. He moves in a very lumbering manner. One wonders, what is there about him? You almost want to go in and sort of help Monty out. He was the first actor, male actor ever, to have this plaintive quality about him. He wasn't only a sex symbol, he was kind of like a mothering symbol. People wanted to mother him. And it was a most amazing debut for any film actor. And his influence still pervades.
And your escort's very beautiful, Elizabeth Taylor.
Is she beautiful?
I think so. Elizabeth, haven't seen you in a long time.
How are you?
You're both working in a place in the sun, aren't you?
That's right.
Yes.
And I came home one day, and there he was, talking with my father. And I never forgot that. He was a mercurial, fascinating, enigmatic man. Smoked like a chimney, was interested in everything. And I just never forgot him. And at that point, he was considered one of the top actors in the United States. He'd just been nominated for the Academy Award for The Search, which was a movie that Fred Zinnemann directed. After that, I saw him periodically for about 2 years. In fact, my father helped him. He wanted to see how a person goes to their death in a prison. He was playing this guy who was put to death. And so my father, who was a lawyer, helped him stay overnight at San Quentin Prison in the death house. And I remember he came back and told us all about it, walking back and forth across our living room, talking about what it was like to be in condemned row. His relationship, his friendship with Elizabeth Taylor was an extraordinary one. It went back to when she was 18 and he was, I guess, 27 and making Place in the Sun, and she fell in love with him. And he sort of fell in love with her, and they had a romance.
Monty would go just so far in the relationship, and then he would bring a boy onto the set. When I say boy, I mean he would bring a young man onto the set. And this would be a rather obvious young man, and Elizabeth meant, of course, to show Elizabeth what was really going on in his life. And Elizabeth would say later on that she didn't know why Monty did that. Was she supposed to feel, was she supposed to say, "It's okay, Monty," or was she supposed to pat him on the back and say, "It's fine with me"? What she finally did was to go over to Monty and say, "Anything you want to do, anything you want me for, is all right, and I will be here."
We all, the four of us traveled, and we flew to Rome, and we spent about, I think it was 5 weeks, 6 weeks in Rome, and then we went down to, well, we went through Positano, but I can't remember now, what's the town below? Amalfi, that's where we were.
Miracolo a Milano was being shot. Monty and I went up to Milan to meet Vittorio De Sica. It was wonderful to have a few moments in the streets of Milan where some of that was being shot. It was through Monty, of course, and the interest of the Italian directors and producers that we met people like De Sica. I remember an incident or two in Rome where we were taken to parties because, of course, Luchino Visconti was hoping that Monty would make a film for him, I believe.
But they would have to take us if they were going to take Monty someplace. So we all went together, and we had a wonderful luncheon in Visconti's beautiful house. And then we were all to go on to this costume party. We didn't have any costumes really, but we stopped under the headlights of a car, and somebody burnt a cork, the old thing. We made up our faces and put bandanas and glasses and everything, and we all went to this wonderful dance. But the thing about being with Monty really was that everything was heightened, and it was always fun, and you always were kidding and laughing, and sometimes at people's expense, but usually it was pretty good-natured. But there was sort of, you felt very special because we had such a good time together.
It was at about this time, I think, that we began to be aware that something wasn't quite right. Some turn began to take place in Monty. He was a daredevil. He'd try anything. He wanted to challenge the edge, whether it was death, how close to danger he could come. And somewhere that probably has got a lot to do with what happened to him, maybe. I remember when we were in Firenze, in Florence, it was there that we were staying at a hotel along the Arno, and then Monty would get out on the balcony and hang there, literally, 6 or 7 floors above the street that runs along the Arno there, by his fingertips, dangling, and then pull himself up, literally. He did this from time to time. He would challenge his body to be able to make this sort of daredevil exploit. When we were returning from Italy, we were on the Queen Mary. There was a hurricane or a storm, a very heavy storm at some time. The liner of the Queen Mary had literally made no headway for 24 hours. It was just holding its own against these very heavy seas and winds. Monty said, why don't we take a terrific picture? I'll go down and get in our cabin. I'll get the porthole open somehow, and I'm going to get a hat and a briefcase and possibly an umbrella. And I'm going to be hanging out of the porthole saying, I'm getting off. As I said, I'm not going to look, I'm not going to look. And I would refuse to watch because I was absolutely certain he was going to kill himself.
I was just turning 18, I guess, and Monty was then 32. And he had just finished making A Place in the Sun. And he was Montgomery Clift, which was, of course, an extremely romantic thing in my eyes. He was very much like an older brother in many ways because he was extremely generous to young people. He was a person who, I think all of us who were friends of his in those days and have spoken about that time with him, had a sense of him guiding us to the best of ourselves. It was a very special generosity in relationship.
We had a lot of fun, but Judy was a very close friend, Judy Balaban, and we used to spend a tremendous amount of time together. I think they were very close, very much in love for a while.
Yes, we were in love. I certainly was very much in love with him. And I think he with me. We spent almost a year together, seeing only each other.
Her father was a very important guy in the motion picture industry. But I thought for a while there they were going to get married, but I don't think Monty was going to marry anybody.
We did. But we did speak about getting married, but as I look back on it, when we spoke about it, it was more in a sense of playfulness and the way that you sort of fantasize what could become of you both later. I was just turning 18, as I said. Monty was very conscious of the difference in our ages. Monty also, because he was a person who was deeply concerned about choice in life, made me conscious that I really had only begun the process of making choices about my life. And perhaps because I was 18, I thought I knew everything and that if I loved him, I should marry him, and that would be that. He never said no, but it was clear in the way that we talked about it that he was simply allowing me the fantasy, really, in a way. It was clear to me in those days that there was a kind of an energy inside of Monty that as much as it was responsible for his joy, it was also responsible for something that was on the other side of him. Because the role was so much he being the older one and he being generous to me about guiding me to grow into the fullest part of myself, he was very reluctant to share that with me, as though it were some sort of burden that he would carry and it was his responsibility. I wished when I got older and we were still friendly, I looked back on the time and wished I had been a little more mature and had understood that a little better, because perhaps I could have given him something more than I did.
He was always having to hide. He led a double life, you know. He went out with women. He had affairs with women, but he also had affairs with men, and he had to keep them very quiet. And I think this was very hard on him. I don't think he liked to hide. And he went and, you know, made very elaborate kinds of defenses and protections for this kind of double life. And he even talked about hating to lead this double life. So I think that was why he was tormented. And he perhaps sought escape in alcohol and drugs.
He had gone to see a psychiatrist and was under some sort of psychiatric guidance, if you want to call it that. And something was happening to him that, well, I don't know enough about it, but whether he was seeking help or whether he got the wrong kind of help from his psychiatrist. There's been a lot of talk about that. That might be what happened to him. The innuendo was that Montgomery Clift's latent homosexuality was allowed to appear.
You know, he was in analysis for many years with this Dr. Silverberg, who was a homosexual himself, and who supposedly couldn't help him about that. So it was a difficult and dark kind of secret for him.
And at that time, of course, he was a major, major movie star, hounded by people on the streets everywhere you went.
And Monty was a person who didn't go to big premieres. You know, he stayed, his social life was a little less glamorous than that. But I guess because it was Paramount, and my father was then head of Paramount, and we were together, that he decided that he should go to the opening of A Place in the Sun. Because he wasn't seen that much at that kind of thing, the fans around the theater absolutely mobbed him. It was insane. And we were, I mean, the car was almost overturned when we arrived and so on.
All right. I must say, it's a pleasure to be here. And I suppose one of the pleasures is that I come to an opening night performance of my own, and I don't have to get up there and do it again.
So when we got into the theater, it was decided that in order to get us out safely, that we would leave. We were sitting in the loge upstairs, and that we would leave just a bit before the film was breaking so that we could be sort of escorted by these guards out and back to the car. And it didn't work exactly, because they saw Monty getting up and people started swarming again. And it got very much, you know, like a sort of a riot. It had a very uncomfortable feeling.
We had gone to a restaurant, and we were sitting there talking, and it was quiet. And there was only one other couple sitting in the booth right in front of us. And the girl, very sort of carefully, in a very unobtrusive way, turned around and looked at us. And during the course of the dinner, she went to the telephone. And what had happened is that we were trying to get down to the Italian street fair downtown. And we'd stopped to get something to eat. So we finished the dinner, and we started out, we got to the sidewalk, and suddenly he said, "Ron." And I turned, and I don't know how many people it was, but it seemed as though there were at least 50 people rushing toward us. Well, fortunately, I don't know, can't get a taxi in New York usually, but there was a taxi. I jumped out, swung open the door. It's a wonder the cab accepted us, because he flung himself in the cab, shot across the cab. I jumped in, slammed the door, and the crowd hit the side of the cab, and crack, and broke the window, right? And we found out later, put a dent in the cab. So, of course, the cab driver, he had to explain to the cab driver, he wasn't charged for it or anything like that. But it was that sort of thing, you know, trying to keep in touch was a life and death game. And that could very well have been, instead of the side of the cab, it could have been him.
And he called one day and he said they'd shut down the shooting and that he needed a rest and he wanted to go to Mexico, and would we go with him? And I said, "Monty, you know, I have the babies," and he said, "Hire somebody, I'll pay for it. Just hire somebody. And please, I need you, I want to go." So we drove to Tijuana and parked the car, got in Aeronaves Reforma, and we went to Baja, and we went to La Paz, which is a little tiny, used to be a pearl fishing place, not a resort. He did not want to go to a resort. It took us 6 hours on the bloody plane, and Fred, who had been a pilot, we hit fog and they had no instruments, and Fred, I thought, was going to go through the plane. By the time we got there, we were a nervous wreck, and it was late at night, and Monty was beside himself. So we went to bed, And I was awake because I was disturbed by some quality that I felt in him. He didn't look well, he didn't act well, he was edgy, there was no fun, there was no play, he was just... So I heard the door of his room open and close, and I heard him go downstairs. I think I was, it's not important, but I think I was not yet undressed, or I pulled on a pair of pants and a shirt. Anyway, I followed him downstairs without him seeing me. And there was a little bar in the hotel, and he had just gone to the bar to sit. And I remembered saying to myself, come off it, you know, you are not his mother, you are not his wife, you are not anything. Whatever, I mean, maybe he's looking for a woman or a man, I don't know what the hell he's looking for, but it's none of your business. Go to bed and shut up and leave him alone. So I went back to bed. I didn't sleep. And it must have been around 4 or 5 in the morning, and I heard this sound on the stairs. And I went to the door and opened the door, and it was Monty on all fours, coming up the stairs, trying to get up the stairs, falling, dead drunk, destroyed, disheveled, had vomited, just destroyed. And I don't mean that he'd been hurt, but he was just crazy. I woke Fred, we picked him up bodily, Fred carried him. We took him to his room, I washed him off a little, and we put him to bed. And I think we spent 3 or 4 days there. And he drank, but not like that, and we really stayed with him. We didn't let him out of our sight because I was, at that point, aware for the first time of the extent of what was going on in him. I had not known. I knew he was drinking. I heard stories of what was happening on the sets. I knew there were problems, but I didn't know it was this bad, and it was bad. And it was a devastating thing because that trip, there was no magic, there was no play, there was no crazy, zany stuff. There was a deadly, serious, haunted kind of quality. And for me, it was the realization that there was something really terribly wrong. It was not a temporary thing, that there was something seriously wrong with him.
Well, Monty was drinking for a reason, and I began to wonder because it looked dangerous, and I suppose I began to wonder why. Well, I began thinking back in those years when he was so totally free of any necessity for drugs of any kind, and what could possibly have happened. And I thought, he used to question me endlessly about some courses that I had had at New York University involving social ethics, morality, particularly social morality. And he would keep asking me, he used to ask me questions. Well, I was no scholar, I'm no philosopher, and wasn't then, but I would tell him what I knew. And the subject of ethics, morality, was constantly coming up in Monty's mind. And I thought, oh, this may be somewhat the key to what is happening to Monty. My feeling is that he was one of those men who take the sins of the world unto themselves and seem to be compulsive in that they become the sole redeemer. If he saw a child being abused or an animal being abused, he took the suffering. He was incapable of coping with the world, so this led to anesthesia via alcohol and possibly stronger drugs. But there was a terrible suffering going on, and it was constant, and it occurred in things that his dearest friends might do, or that I might do, or that his mother and father might do, or his brother might do. They all hurt too much. It was as if his entire nervous system had been exposed. If you'd taken a scalpel and just cut the arms open and cut the whole nervous system open, and then thrown sand, the sands of the world at it, or the salt of the world into this open, sensitive person.
It had always been his real wish to have a home. He needed a home, and I think he knew by then that he couldn't always have a home with us or with the McCarthys, because it wasn't. He needed his own. So he bought a beautiful brownstone on 61st Street. He called us and said, come. Fred, remodel it for me. Jean, you can do the decorating, or help me with the decorating. So again, we had children and we had obligations, but we dropped everything. You see, there's this continuing theme that you tended to drop your own life and go. When Monty needed you or wanted you, you went. Anyway, Fred went back, wrecked the inside of the brownstone. By then, I mean, took out walls, took out a staircase, took out a fireplace, rebuilt, and then Fred came back, and I went with Monty to start picking out carpet. And during the time that Fred and I were there together, Monty became, we saw a whole other side of him. He became frequently the boss. He became authoritarian. He pulled such things as, I paid for your trip here, and I want this, and I want that, and I want it now, and this is taking too long. Fred, I think, was not ever able to forgive that, ever. Yes, he paid for our trip, but no, he did not pay Fred for working 17 hours a day and knocking out and so forth. Monty bought theater tickets one night for Augusta and Kevin and me and Mira and I don't know who all. There was not a ticket bought for Fred, because Fred was to stay there and finish a job. And Freddie really never forgave him for that. I didn't really forgive him either, but I fought back. I said, you know, I'm here, but I had some sort of feeling I was here as a friend. And I'm not going to finish this today. I'll take care of it tomorrow. During the work on the brownstone, I would often wear an old sweater, an old shirt of Monty's, or an old jacket. Or, you know, the place was cold and it was whatever, and I'd put on an old jacket and I'd have Kleenex. I'd reach in a pocket and I'd pull out a handful of pills. Blue, gray, red. Some of them I recognized, some of them I didn't have any idea what they were, but they'd just be loose in his pocket along with tobacco and whatever. So it became very apparent, and I don't know whether we were reluctant to look at it or what, but it became terribly apparent that he was on, you name it, he was on it. He was drinking heavily, and the combination was dynamite. We put him to bed many nights. Sometimes I would go in and have to shake him awake, and he would be absolutely slugged with Nembutal, Seconal, whatever. There were bottles, apothecary bottles of 500 Nembutal, 500 Seconal. We lived in Libby Holman's townhouse, which was up the street, because the brownstone was not livable, and Fred would have to go back to California, and I would stay on. And Monty and I, you know, quotes, lived together in the sense that we both stayed at Monty's friend's house, but there was never, we were not in any other kind of a relationship. He was at that time deeply in his relationship with Libby Holman.
Monty seemed to have a great need for a relationship with an older woman. There had been several in his life. Libby, at this point, was in her mid to late 40s, and she had had several tragedies. Oddly, they were with younger men about the age of Monty. Her first husband had committed suicide. Her second husband had committed suicide. So by the time she had met Monty, she had seen a great deal of life, and she was very sophisticated. No one really knows exactly the intimate details of Monty's relationship with Libby Holman. But one thing is clear, that she was extremely possessive of him. There was much speculation about what her presence in his life meant. There were those who said that she absolutely destroyed Monty, that she introduced him to pills, she introduced him to strange sexual habits, and none of this has been verified. She might have been absolutely wonderful for him.
When I came back to California, we were to see him very little. We finally moved out on the west side of town. And Monty would sometimes show up at 2 o'clock in the morning and bang on the gates, and we would tear downstairs, and he was drunk and wanted to talk and rave, and we finally had to put a stop to it. I remember Fred telling him one night, "Monty, don't ever do this again. Just don't do this to us."
Monty had indications that we had ignored of his being not just a daredevil, but also accident-prone, and he did things that were unusual. My sister, Mary McCarthy, thought that Monty, I remember a long time ago, she said there's something the matter with Monty. His behavior is infantile. It's like hebephrenic schizophrenia. This return to infantile behavior. He'd take the steak off the plate and carve it on the floor, the way my little daughter would like to eat her food off, you know, her little high chair, not on a plate, not with a spoon, but just shove it into her mouth. And Monty would do the same.
It was during that period, and I don't know what he was filming at the time, but he knew Elizabeth Taylor well. She was married to Michael Wilding, and he called us and said he wanted to go out to dinner with the Wildings, with Elizabeth and Michael, and would we come up and meet them at the house. So we went up, and Elizabeth was in tears, was locked in her bedroom. We never saw her. Monty was very drunk and ugly, really ugly in a way that it's difficult to describe. He became like an animal. And we knew we couldn't go out to dinner. No way were we going to allow him to be in public, and so we just said, well, let's fix dinner here. Fred and I are both good cooks. Michael said, go into the kitchen, help yourself, whatever's in the kitchen. He was, I guess, angry, I don't know. So we went into the kitchen, all we could find were eggs, and I think some mushrooms or whatever, and we decided we'd make an omelet. And Monty was furious, he was enraged. We were going out, and Fred said, no, we are not going out. We're going to eat here. And Monty finally said, all right, but if we're going to eat here, I'll make the eggs. And he took the eggs away from Fred, and he started beating them, and he spit into them over and over again, just spit into the eggs. And I thought, you know, this is crazy. What are we doing? What are we doing up here? What is this about? So I said, you know, Freddie, let's get out of here. This is insane. This is no life. You can't be with him. It's not possible to be with him.
He wanted to reform himself and get his body back to where it ought to be in his mind and clean himself up. And he needed somebody to go along with. As I was saying to someone, I wonder what Monty saw in Augusta and me. And I decided maybe he saw us as being healthy. I think Augusta and I were probably good, middle-class Americans that seemed very healthy, and perhaps we were believable and hopeful images of some kind to him. At any rate, that night, I went up to this party up on Beverly Estates Drive at this beautiful house that Liz Taylor and Michael Wilding were living in, and I found that Monty was on the wagon. He was emulating my teetotaling and was not taking anything to drink of any kind, and was on his best behavior. That night, I left early because I had to go up to San Francisco. I said I was saying goodbye to him. He said, no, wait, I'm going to leave too. And we went out into a little parking area outside Liz's house, and we talked for a while, and he talked about how tough it was to work in films. Now, it was as though there was a gap between his understanding of what happens when you act and the Hollywood imagination of what happens when you act and what you do and how you are when you are. He really was depressed by his experiences in front of the camera here. He talked a little bit about that. And we got in our cars, and I started down, and it was quite a steep descent. And as we were proceeding down, it was about 11 o'clock at night, I would guess. At that time, the Beverly Estates Drive was not built up. It was a fairly lonely road, and there were a couple of very sharp hairpin turns in the hill going down. I became aware that Monty's car was coming up very close behind me. The headlights were much too close, and I was getting a little bit nervous, and there was a turn coming. I thought, if he should bump me, I'm going to go right through that fence there and down into the canyon below. So I tried to pull away from his car by speeding up a little bit, and I made the turn very quickly. But on the next turn, I was watching in my rearview mirror. I saw the lights going, his headlights. I could even see a cloud of dust flailing back and forth, and suddenly there were no lights in my rearview mirror. There was nothing there. I turned my car around, assuming he was stuck, and I drove back the 150 or 200 yards to the point that he seemed to be. As I came up, my headlights disclosed that his car was smashed up. The front end was all battered and bashed. And I looked in, and Monty's body was crunched up underneath the dashboard somehow. How he got down there, I don't know, but evidently as he came around that last turn, or as his car was swinging around, he either blacked out and faded out, and he had some sort of experience of blacking out, I'm told, or I heard later, after the fact. And the impact of these turns as the car was hitting one side and another along the embankment, and there was a telegraph pole involved there somewhere, I believe, too, a telephone pole. And I reached in, tried to open the door. You couldn't get the door open to see. I think I went back and got my car, drove it up closer to throw a little more light into the interior. And as I looked in, I could see what looked like a face all ripped apart. Blood and no sound of any kind. I assumed that, I guess I was afraid that he was dead. There seemed to be no alternative but to leave him and go back, and that's what I did. I drove back up to the house and alerted Michael and Liz of what had happened. And we got back down there and looked into the car, and Monty was moving a little bit. And Liz, I said, we can't get to him. The doors are jammed. And she went through the back door. She climbed over the seat, and she somehow got down into the car and was able to somehow cradle Monty's broken, battered head. And he said, my teeth are, and evidently his teeth had been knocked out, his front teeth, and they were stuck in his throat. And she reached into his mouth and pulled those broken teeth out of his throat.
Right after, during his recovery, Libby Holman came out and stayed with him. And I'd always spend the weekends and any afternoon I was off working. And they had a serious break in their relationship because Monty decided to go back and finish the film. And he looked really bad, and he'd been healed quickly. I don't know what had gone on medically, but he'd healed with what he called colloidal tissue. His head hit the windshield of the car, and his upper lip was broken. His jaw was snapped off on both sides, and these teeth were knocked out. And he just really looked very bad, but he healed. He was in terrible pain and was taking in immense amounts of painkillers. And anyway, Libby said he must not go back to work. that he should go back to New York, spend a long time recovering, and heal slowly, that the studio wouldn't appreciate it. And indeed they didn't. He decided to go back to work. And she left. She said that she couldn't help him. Monty did go back to work, was nearly finished shooting the film. And I was there one Saturday with him by this swimming pool, and he disappeared. He had this bedroom that he'd put up black curtains. It was like a sick room. And he was gone, and he was gone, and he was gone. And I got worried about him. And I went into the house, and I heard this noise. I realized it was Monty weeping, but just weeping. So anyway, I left. He didn't see me. And I went out and sat back outside as the sun slowly set. And Monty came out after, like, about another hour. You could see he'd been crying. And he said when he went into the house that he looked at himself in the mirror for the first time since the accident. And he said, "Do you know, I still think I have a career. I still think I can work again." And I realized that he'd finished this film, Raintree County, thinking he had no career, that he'd never work again. But he just finished it out of this obligation to finish it, looking the way he did.
He had made a movie after the accident called The Young Lions, and he called me and said there was going to be a showing of it, and would I come, because he really felt that his work was very good in that, and I was more surprised that he would say such a thing. He'd never said such a thing of himself or his work. So indeed, I did go to see it, and while his work was, of course, good, very good as always, the change, physical change in him was so startling to me. It was like, as you say, before and after. It was like another, because he'd been, supremely beautiful, and that was, while he was still terribly moving and good as an actor, I had to get used to the change.
One side of his face was paralyzed, so he couldn't move it. So he had to learn how to use his face in a new way, a different way. I mean, an actor's face is his destiny. It's what he works with. It's his instrument, and particularly in the movies. And Montgomery Clift could only really use his eyes. If you notice his movies after the accident, it's his eyes and the way he uses his body, but not the way he uses his face, his mouth, etc., because he couldn't move his mouth. But he actually learned how to use his face in a different way. But he was so upset by it, about the loss of his beauty, that he took all the mirrors down in his house. He had mirrors all over the place, because he was very vain. In fact, he told somebody that he realized he'd gotten away with murder being so handsome. That now I know the way everybody else feels. I'm being treated in a different kind of way, because I'm not so beautiful anymore.
The courage of this man was incredible. I never heard him actually complain about pain, physical or mental.
City-bred fella and a country girl living on a hunk of land in Tennessee that the government was going to take away from them. But there was this very, very strong sexual pull between these two people. But Monty was not in any way an overtly sort of capital M masculine man. He was far more sort of tender and gentle. So that everything that came out of rehearsals, everything that film has in it, really came from him as an original way of dealing with this love story. He had a strange kind of magnetism which was different than what one usually sees. And we would rehearse, And he very often just would improvise. The script, in any case, was very, very short, and most of the work in it was fleshed out with Kazan's guiding hand behind both of us. He had no confidence in himself at all, as an actor, as a man, as a person, with friends, although he had many friends who loved him a lot. But his lack of self-esteem, I thought, was very touching, very moving, very sad. And there was an element of sadness in him all the time.
But whatever was troubling him, or whatever his demons were, you just tried to be as supportive as be there when he needed you, or do whatever you could for him, because he didn't outwardly ask for help. He didn't he would joke about it even, so that it was hard to do anything except be there, you know. But he was always, even in the first scene in The Misfits, when he's in a telephone booth talking to his mother, I guess, I don't know how, you can't describe superb acting any more than you can describe fresh air. I mean, I don't know how to say how it is, except that scene was extraordinary. Whatever his gift was, that was always there.
Monty had invited me for dinner with Marilyn Monroe. He was out here, they were, I guess, still making The Misfits, and he'd come from Vegas to Los Angeles, was staying at the Bel Air Hotel, and he asked a couple of friends to go to dinner with her. When I showed up at the Bel Air Hotel, Monty was in his cups. He'd been drinking, and there was no question he shouldn't have gone out. And I said, "Kid, the dinner's over. You know, you just can't go out." And unfortunately, he had a limousine and a driver, and he could go out. And I left, and another good friend of his, Jim Bridges, left. But he went on to that dinner. It's not Marilyn Monroe's fault. But he did go on, and it's a famous dinner that was a debacle at, I'm smiling because I know I've had it accounted to me, and she was apparently very sweet about it. That Monty decided to feed her fried shrimp and ramaki with his feet, and in the beachcombers. And apparently he took off his shoes and socks and dipped the hors d'oeuvres in the sauces, and she ate them, I believe, and was very sweet to him.
His relationship with Marilyn Monroe was a very special one in his life. He absolutely adored her. They were like children together. I think they recognized this incredible vulnerability in each other, or if you want to say weakness. They were insomniacs, chronic insomniacs, and they were always talking about how do you fall asleep. Neither of them could sleep. In fact, when The Misfits was being made, Monty had his own bed set out to Reno, which is sort of unusual to have your bed set out when you're doing a movie. But he and Marilyn would talk about how they fell asleep. Monty would, for instance, call people all over the world on the phone and just talk all night until he fell asleep, and Marilyn Monroe would get massaged. She had a special masseuse who would come and massage her, but they still couldn't sleep. So, of course, they finally took pills. Once, I think, Marilyn Monroe said, Montgomery Clift is the only person I know who's sicker than I am.
I was out there in Munich and in Vienna for 5 months, and it was a terribly torturous time, actually. It was a very, very difficult subject, of course, and Monty, I had no previous Monty to compare him to. I just knew he was a wonderful actor, and I enormously liked him right away. And he was extremely generous and extremely forthcoming. But I didn't understand much about drink and drugs, I suppose. And I not a lot about mental illness. So, as I say, I was very green on the subject.
This was a film that starred Montgomery Clift. It was called Freud. And, you know, you can blame John Huston for having cast him in the film, because anyone seeing Monty would think he couldn't make it. He just absolutely couldn't make this film. He was fine in The Misfits because he had a fairly small part. But to be on camera constantly, could this man who fell into the shakes every afternoon and had the DTs, could he have, you know, done a major film? But Huston, as he said later on, was fooled by Monty's great performance in The Misfits and his seeming energy in the film. During the making of Freud, Huston saw that Monty's energies were waning early, and I guess he had such enormous hopes for this one project that he and Monty just could not get along any longer.
The relationship with John Huston was terrible. It was terrible. They were just so utterly opposed as people. Huston was a great big bear of a man. He's a great big, sort of Corinthian column type person. And intolerant and impatient and hard. And cruel. And Monty had was just totally other. It was just totally other. It was two people who just were not in any way, there was no point of meeting really for them. Monty, I think, was an incredibly difficult person, a very, very difficult, neurotic man to deal with.
He pressured Monty. Monty forgot his lines. Things would go wrong. Eventually, Huston had to put lines on what they call idiot cards for Monty to be able to say them. Then there was this constant rewriting process. It went on for months. Meanwhile, the company, I believe it was Universal, lost a fortune in Freud. And Monty, terrible things were happening to him. He developed cataracts.
What had happened was that there's a scene at the very end of the film in which one of the extras had to come up and say "dirty Jew" and tip his hat. And he was an extra, and he wasn't probably very technically efficient. And I think at one point I believe this is what happened, he hit Monty in the eye. Monty always had those amazing eyes. I mean, you could just really, really go into his eyes. But they were very, very sensitive. Anyway, I think he'd had cataract trouble already. And this gesture of the extra had aggravated the situation, and he'd taken fright and gone straight off to London, which angered John Huston very much. He came back to work the next day, and you know, he was very, very frightened of getting a cataract. I mean, he worked all through this film with a fear. He had this kind of morbid fear that he was going to lose his sight.
He was very ill. He had a strange kind of hypothyroid condition which caused him to age prematurely. His hands gnarled at the age of 40, and his hair started falling out, and he got cataracts. This condition is the condition of the old, and he got it at the age of 40.
He was absolutely a loner. He was completely an individual, very selfish, as most artists are. but with an enormous regard for truth and for putting the best of himself into what he was doing, his work. But I should think, at great cost to his personal relationships often, particularly not to relationships. I did used to sometimes come back feeling, once or twice, I didn't make a lot of weekends back. I usually only got one day anyway, to London, but I used to sometimes feel as if I was dried out, bleached out bones on a plane that had been left by Monty. But, I have got huge energy and huge stamina. But I guess for people who hadn't, and I think people who became, well, certainly people who would become involved in a love, sexual relationship, that must have been very hard for Monty, but no, didn't have to be sexual. His friends, he used his friends like crazy. But then I happen to think that that's what friends are for.
Probably what was the major reason that my brother died was that John Huston brought a very unfair lawsuit against him, which Monty eventually won, but he couldn't get insurance to do another movie, so he went for 4 years without making a movie, and for Monty, not working was terribly depressing.
That's, of course, when the terrible years began. He was stuck in his house. He couldn't even make it when to visit his agent. The high point in his day might have been a visit to the dentist.
And it was an evening, and I don't really remember the circumstances except that Fred found him. He had gone up the fire escape, and he was on the roof of his brownstone in his pajamas, drunk and on pills of whatever, I don't know what was in his system. And he was literally walking the parapet, just staggering. And Freddie just picked him up, and by then, Monty, you see this marvelous body, this incredibly strong, physically fit body, was just shot. There was nothing left. And Freddie just picked him up and threw him over his shoulder like a bag of flour, brought him down the stairs, and put him to bed. And I remember, I think that was one of several times, but it was one last time, and it really, I think, as I remembered, it was my goodbye to him. I held him. He was not really totally conscious, but he couldn't go to sleep. He was just, I don't know what to say. It was like he wasn't able to let go. And I held him in my arms, as I had done before. And I literally rocked him, and I smoothed his hair, and I talked to him, and I could feel him relax. And I remember he went to sleep in my arms, just cradled, and I put him in bed and covered him up. And I really, as I think back, I know that I said goodbye to him then.
He had to have the attention round the clock of I don't know what to call him, Larry, a guy named Larry who came in, just almost lived with Monty 24 hours a day. It was a godsend that we were able to find somebody like Larry to take care of Monty, and he seemed so devoted to Monty, but Monty had to have someone with him almost all the time.
The nurse would walk with him on the street and support him as he walked. There was just nothing one could do about him. He became almost a legend in those days, the fallen movie star, and you'd see him on the street and people would say, oh, there he is, he's just, what's happened to him? Oh, God.
We finally just didn't see him anymore. It became too painful because there was nothing really to be done. He didn't seem to do anything except he became obsessed with his own deeds and doings, his own thoughts. He had difficulty finishing a sentence. They would always wander. It isn't that he would stop, but they would, you know, there were so many byways down which his mind would turn that no sentence ever seemed to be finished.
Gradually, one after the other, just turned their backs on him because of what they felt was behavior that they couldn't put up with. And it is true that he used to do some pretty weird things sometimes. But he had given them so much friendship for so long. And then when it looked like to me, because I was around then, when he needed them the most, you know, they weren't there.
It was not possible to have any kind of relationship. You couldn't be his friend. We recognized that we had taken care of him. We had grown up. We knew what we'd been doing, and we had to look at why. And we had to give him up and let him go. And there was nothing that anybody could do. No one could help him. He was way beyond help.
And I had him come to the studio, and I set up the lights, and he had very definite ideas of how he wanted to be photographed. He wanted to be very brooding. He asked me if it would be possible if I could catch him with the tear in his eye. And then he asked me if I had any little pin spots, little tiny lights that I could put near my camera that would hit him each eye, because he felt very strongly that eyes and eye contact with the camera said more than words. And if you looked at any of the scripts he would have pages of dialogue totally eliminated, where he would tell him, just come in and take a close-up on my eyes, or just come in and take my hands. His secret to acting was omission, getting rid of extra things that didn't matter, that you could do away with. He knew cameras. He knew that if you came in for a close-up, he could give you something with his eyes that 2 paragraphs of dialogue wouldn't do as well. While I was taking the photographs of him, I realized that there was no way I was going to be able to give him what he wanted. It was just a self-destructive look that he felt. He wanted to hurt himself. Just the idea of, see if you can catch a tear in my eye, gives you an insight into what he thought of himself at that period in his life.
Monty was very upset about the deaths of Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe. He talked to a friend of his about it at one point at dinner. He said, deaths always come in threes. He didn't say, I'm going to be next, but he was obviously very concerned. It's a sort of theatrical kind of prophecy or prediction. When 3 people or 2 people in a cast die, there's always going to be a third. Actors always believe that. Anyway, Monty did, and as it turned out, he was the 3rd member of that cast to die.
At the very end, when he was desperate to get back into the movies, his old friend Elizabeth Taylor did try to help. And she did a wonderful thing. She was at that time receiving $1 million per picture. And she was slated to go into a film called Reflections in a Golden Eye. And she said, I will only appear in this film if my co-star is Montgomery Clift. Now, when Elizabeth asked for Monty, and they objected, they said that Monty was not bankable, you know, they would lose their shirts, she said, well, I will put up my entire salary, which of course was $1 million, to ensure Monty.
And that's when he realized he had to show everyone that he was insurable. And he did do this one film, The Defector, due to Salka Viertel, who had seen him and knew that he was in wonderful shape, and assured the director, Raoul Levy, that he would be give no problems, and he didn't give any problems. And it isn't a very good film, but it would have been good for him, even if it wasn't a good film, because it was shown that he could work well.
And he went to Germany with his nurse, his male nurse, and Mira Rostova, his former acting coach. And somehow got through the filming. I mean, it was just agony for him to get through these days. He would be exhausted halfway through it. He would try too hard. His attitude was almost that he was making From Here to Eternity all over again. And Mira kept telling him, you know, just get through it, Monty. It doesn't matter. She just wanted him to live.
And he did things like in The Defector, he would jump into the Danube in the freezing water. Everybody else on the bank was wearing fur coats. Then the current swept him away, and he had to be picked up by grappling hooks, and that hurt his shoulder and his back again. After The Defector, it was like a new life for him. It was like a rebirth, because he had showed everybody that he could remember his lines, contrary to what Houston had said. The future was like just beginning. It was as if he was about to make his first movie. But he had a calcium deficiency, and he loved his steaks too much. So the cholesterol built up, and then he was also in pain, you know, for years from his automobile accident. So I have to think that maybe his premature death was maybe for the best, because it was very painful to live.
The last day of his life he did spend alone in the house, although Larry was there. He really wanted to be by himself. He didn't want to talk with Larry at all. So Larry let him be by himself, and had the door of his bedroom was closed. And at one point, late in the evening, Larry realized that The Misfits was going to be on television. He thought maybe Monty would like to see it. And he knocked on his door and he said, "The Misfits is on. Do you want to see it?" And Monty said, "No, absolutely not." And that was the last thing that Larry heard him say. He died that night. Died of a heart attack. That's what the coroner told me.
A man whom I know, whose name I won't mention, he's a man in show business, came up to me at a very large party as I walked in and was saying hello to everybody very happily and gregarious about the evening. He came up to me and, I'll never understand this to this day, sort of smiling, said to me, "Hey, did you hear?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Montgomery Clift died." Well, not only was I shocked by what he was saying, but the fact of a person who had such a smile on his face, I don't think he meant to be cruel, but there was such an insensitivity to that, and so much the opposite of what Monty was, for a person to tell you about another person's death as though it was a piece of hot news that you would just go, "Oh, well, no, wow, I didn't hear that." I'll never forget that. I think it's one of the strangest moments in my life.
It's funny, at the funeral, people tended not to know one another. They were all sitting in isolated parts of the church. They just sat there, not talking, and it said so much about his life and his relationships with people, that he could not really organize his entire life and make it one. He couldn't introduce friends to one another. He had so many different problems introducing some trashy friend to some movie star friend, you know, that kind of thing.
One of the most perceptive eulogies after his death came from the Vatican's Osservatore Romano, which said in an editorial that there was in his solitary life an example to remember, the example of his integrity as an artist, of his contempt for success without problems, or for wealth without scruples.
It was as though there were two sides of Monty. There was this lovely, beautiful, incredible human being, and there was another darker side to him. And his whole life was a battle, was a fight, this inner fight. And that side killed him. That side won out. The self-destructive Monty destroyed the other person. And it was a tremendous tragedy. But I look back on all of it, and I can only say that I feel blessed that I knew him. I feel that it was a gift.
I have, this recurring dream that my brother is alive, and we meet in a bookstore, and we sit at a counter, and we talk, and he asks me how I feel about his resurrection. And I answer, well, I guess you never died. And I think that's really true. I don't think he ever will. Thank you.